Hello, and welcome to another special edition of SpectrumCast, health checks for your data resilience environment. I'm your host, Steve Keniston, and today I'm joined by Todd Owczarzak from our technical support organization, Jason Basler from our development team, and Jim Smith, who is also from our development team. Morning, gentlemen.
Morning, Steve.
So today we've got a pretty interesting topic. It's this notion around a backup window. And mostly when I hear about the backup window, it's folks talking about how a backup job is kicked off and it goes through the evening and it moves data from your primary storage and makes a copy, doesn't move, makes a copy of your data from your primary storage to your secondary storage. And, you know, a lot of folks think that's the backup process, but that really isn't the whole story. So Todd, let's take a moment and start with you this week. When folks think of backup in that process, it's made up of more than just making a copy of that primary storage. Could you elaborate maybe on the full set of processes that go on during a backup process?
Sure, Steve. Like you say, there's that foundational point of just getting your data off its source position and into a repository to be kept or backed up or just retained for future use. And it really comes down to a deep definition of recognizing that there's more to it than that. You obviously want your data where you need it from a backup position, how you need it so that you can get to it when you want it for as long as you want it. And so in order to make sure that that single backup that gets into your repository gets to all those places or ends up in that position where you need it, you need to consider how it needs to be managed once it's in the repository. And so that includes things in Spectrum Protect, like the expiration processes that need to run, database backups of your actual Spectrum Protect DB2 database so that you ensure that you still have that catalog to the things you've backed up. And then depending upon your distinct needs, it may include also the copy storage pool processing, migration processing, reclamation if you're using tape or other sequential media. And then we also have features that allow you to protect your data in container storage pools to replicate that data. And that's both for container storage pools and device class pools as well. And then we also have storage rules that can do some additional work against your data to ensure that it's where it needs to be. You've got tiering activities, you've got cloud reclamation, you've got copy data processing to copy your containers to tape. You've got other maintenance-like activities where you can audit your storage pools to ensure that they're maintaining their integrity. And you've got the generation of dedupe stats, which may be essential for just an awareness of what you've got going on your server. And then in addition to that, you've got DB2 that needs to do some work on itself just to maintain the health of its tables and indices. So the reorganization activity, which Spectrum Protect Server will actually drive based upon its communication with DB2 and the needs that the 2C are needed for your table maintenance, that's critical to allow the windows to run in this period so that in the end, you've got everything in place, where you want it, how you want it, and it's there when you need it, for how long you need it, in all the different possible configurations that Spectrum Protect allows you to put in place.
Great, very, very helpful, Todd. And those are definitely some things I don't think everyone thinks about that happen during that particular process. And Jason, you kind of have an interesting way to kind of take us through this 24 hours in a day where these other jobs might be happening or be running. Can you take us through some of these jobs and maybe describe how administrators ought to be thinking about some of these processes and that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure, Steve. When I talk about data protection and the backup window, I like to respin the backup window as the daily cycle. Backup window is part of it, but you have a cycle you need to get through on a repeatable basis. And there's actually an image we use to kind of convey that concept. It's what we call the wheel of life. So you can think of it like a clock face, and we lay out the various tasks that you need to get through in that daily cycle. And it's kind of sequenced from the most important task to the least important. But I think as Todd has laid out, really these are all fundamentally important, and you can't afford to miss any of them. But importance, obviously, not just importance, but there's a logical sequencing to these things too. So you can't really take another copy of your backup until you've made that first copy. So it's pretty logical that you would take your primary backup as the first thing you do in that daily cycle. The next most important phase is to get your secondary copy of that backup. And so to Todd's point, how you achieve that second copy will really depend on which architecture you've selected. So it may be replication, it may be getting a copy of that data out to tape storage, but fundamentally that's the next logical thing that needs to happen in your daily sequence. And then after we get those second copies, we need to protect the backup system itself. And so in the case of Spectrum Protect, that's our, the DB2 database where we have all of the metadata about the backups. We need to get a copy of that so that in the case of a disaster, you have something to work from. Just having a bucket full of tapes is not going to do you any good if you don't have that catalog to help, direct you where you need to get the data off the tapes. And then after that, we have this very nebulous phase that we call the maintenance phase. Now, I can just wave my hand and say, well, that's where you take care of all the other stuff that you need to keep a healthy environment. But as you heard Todd say, there's really a lot of things that can potentially happen in there. And fundamentally, that maintenance phase is where we are getting the system ready to take the next day's backup on an ongoing basis. And fundamentally, you can think of one of the key things we're taking care of there is making sure we maintain enough free space in the system so that this cycle can keep going on endlessly. And so, one way I give an analogy of what this maintenance task is doing is with kind of comparing it to a reservoir. And as you can think, as you're planning a reservoir, you're thinking all about capacity. Do I have enough capacity to hold all this water without breaking my dam and flooding all the civilians down below the dam? And so in data protection, we've designed things like the storage pools, the database, all with enough capacity to sustain this daily cycle and meeting all of your SLAs. And there's sort of a steady state, I call it, where you get into the phase where you've filled that reservoir up to what your targeted normal capacity is. And as new stuff flows in, those are the new backups that are coming in, you need to make sure you drain enough of the old stuff so that you're keeping enough room for the new stuff to continuously come in. And so that's where maintenance comes in. Maintenance is maintaining that free capacity, not only in the storage pools, but also, as Todd mentioned, in DB2. DB2 has records that represent things that over time get deleted, and we may need to make sure DB2 is properly maintaining free space in all of its database tables to keep going in that ongoing basis. So, the sequence is important. Another key point is it has to be sustainable, right? If you have a daily cycle that you want to complete in 24 hours, you need to be able to get that done in 24 hours. Otherwise, you can get into a backlog where you may become hopelessly behind. And, I think one kind of key point is it's okay occasionally that you exceed your 24-hour cycle, right? You might have some anomaly where you back up more stuff than you normally would, and that means your second copy is going to take a little longer. It might go greater than 24 hours, but if that's happening every day, you're never going to have the recovery points that your SLAs require you to have, because you're continuously exceeding that cycle and you're never finishing anything. And so I think probably a lot of folks in our audience have been in that case where you have a system that's so hopelessly behind, you feel like it can never get caught up again. That's what we want you to avoid. Don't get into that situation in the first place through careful planning and making sure things are operating as they're supposed to be.
Great. Thanks, Jason. The more we talk, the more I definitely learn, number one, and number two, also just come to understand that there's a lot of things to pay attention to. And this really has to be, you really have to apply some focus to it in order to do a good job. And data resilience is becoming more and more important as data grows. So Jim, my assumption is that a lot of administrators understand that they have processes within their backups, and sometimes those processes aren't working, maybe because some data protection log tells them they failed, or the data that should have been copied just isn't in that secondary location. Could you possibly provide us with some best practices or some diagnostics admins could follow to kind of validate that their processes are working okay and working properly, and they should feel good about what they're doing?
Sure, Steve. I think very simply, the the number one spot is this concept of a dashboard, whether we're talking about the Operations Center or we're talking about the Spectrum Protect Plus user interface. We often give the analogy of the dashboard. We talk about the cup of coffee. It's the thing you look at every morning. And you can think of the dashboard just literally like your car dashboard, right? You have a dashboard in your car that's there because you're not a mechanic, but you need to know things about your car, your system. And some of the things are quite obvious, right? Like the gas tank. Everybody kind of knows intuitively that when that gas tank shows low, you've got to put gas in it. There's other things that might not be so intuitive, and you have to kind of get accustomed to them, like the temperature gauge, for example. Jason talked about steady state. So the temperature gauge is something in your car that you look at it once, you don't understand what it's telling you, but as you get accustomed to looking at it every day, you understand what's kind of the normal for that particular gauge. And so the same way with some of the gauges in the Operations Center or in Spectrum Protect Plus, you kind of get accustomed by just looking habitually every day, Steve, at your dashboard, understanding, okay, this doesn't look normal today. Then you have the concept of alerts. Your car tells you things periodically. There's a check engine light. There's a check oil light. Some of us don't know the difference. And you go to your manual, but you know that you're being told to do something. And then you have the cryptic, even your car gives you cryptic messages like A3, right? And you have to know that that's when you call service. But getting in that habit, again, the daily cup of coffee and just kind of looking to see if there's anything that looks out of whack from how you normally look at the system is a great starting point. And then Todd kind of mentioned there's tools like ServerMon or SPPMon that provide historical analysis, so that if something does look odd one day, you have a record and you can go back and look for patterns, or you can call service and you have data to provide. So I think, just simply looking at that dashboard a few minutes a day and moving on with the rest of your routines is probably the best starting point for this.
Great. Thanks, Jim. So let's just, kind of talk amongst ourselves here for a second. So we all know that there now are multiple jobs that make up this full process, from just this first copy to the second copy to the other jobs that need to provide cleanup. And we've identified maybe some ways in which you can possibly find out how some of these processes aren't working right. The big question is, what steps do we find out there that administrators might be able to take to kind of help themselves fix things? Todd, do you want to start us off here?
Yeah, well, I think it begins with what Jim was talking about, and really understanding, how your system operates, or what it looks like when it's operating at its best, right? Where is that temperature gauge? What's your gas mileage that you're getting, and recognizing when maybe that's a little bit off, and having the details and the information behind it, so you know how things are operating, what they look like when they're in their best positions, operating as you need them to be, so that as you begin to gauge, you have something to compare them against if things aren't quite operating the same way, right? And as you mentioned, the ServerMon, the SPPMon, those can give you an historical means to be able to go back and look at that stuff as you might see something not operating, maybe that temperature gauge is moving a little bit into the high category, or you're seeing the equivalent of that within Spectrum Protect or Plus would be your processes are taking longer than you wanted them to, and they're overflowing, right? So you begin to drill down, whether it's through your logs or through some of the outputs available through the monitoring tools, ServerMon or SPPMon, and just look at which one is running longer than expected, or are there certain other indicators within the messaging or within the query output that can be obtained from some of those things. It gives you some insight into where within this 24 wheel, as Jason's talked about, is the problem. Is it one that's running long that's then driving the other activities? So it's just, again, kind of getting a feel for knowing your system like you would know your car, and then sensing when things are not where they should be, being able to really drill down based upon your knowledge and your history and the facts you have to see what might be, the source. And, a lot of things I think administrators can identify on their own. They can take a look at the messages in the logs, or the query output that they can get from from the servers, and then take a look at what might be leading to the things to not be where they wanted to be in their best case scenario.
I wish, kind of wish being a backup admin was as easy as driving a car. You guys make it sound kind of simple. Jason or Jim, you guys have anything else to add there?
Yeah, I'll just follow on to say often, Todd and Jim have given a good viewpoint of how you kind of watch what's normal and get familiar with things when they're operating at their best. And once things are no longer operating at their best, you often start with a simple question: what's changed? Now, a simple example might be one of your customers that you're providing data protection for suddenly has added a bunch of new data that's in the system that needs to be protected. So, if you're monitoring one of the key metrics of your backup system, which is the daily ingest, how much new data is flowing in, you can see patterns there. And if your typical ingest was 20 terabytes per day, but now for the past week, it's suddenly doubled, that's all going to have a downstream effect. It takes longer for that backup to come in. It takes longer to make the second copy. Maintenance has more to expire. So, it may be that your customer has now pushed your system beyond the specs that you designed it for, and you'll have to take corrective action by moving that extra data they have added into the mix to another repository, for example. But there's other things, so the what's changed question often, it can lead in many unpredictable directions, but sometimes it's, some change in your infrastructure. Maybe your network admins have changed something on your network fabric where the data is not flowing through as fast as it can be. So, that would fall into the category of performance issue. And certainly Todd and the rest of us have quite a bit of experience helping customers pinpoint where, things have changed to cause degraded performance from what is normal. So I think this is, it's a good, just start with the simple what's changed and work from there. And if you don't pay attention to what's normal, it's really hard to get the answer to what's changed. You're kind of grasping at straws at that point. So this is important.
I think that's some really good advice, Jason. The fact that someone adds some capacity, or does not just even that, right? But things that do evolve within the environment that could be unexpected, right? It's nice to kind of go and look at the dashboard and you see the different things that happened in that period. But maybe someone was doing something just for that next 24 hours. So do all of a sudden you make a big bunch of changes when all of a sudden this might have been a one-time thing, or is this something I need to start planning for?
So Steve, I just might add to that, there's obviously the additions that can be significant, but sometimes it's also the takeaways. You've maybe reduced your retention periods, or you deleted a bunch of file spaces. And while those don't seem like obvious things that would have an effect on your maintenance cycle, the internal processing that needs to go on, especially when it gets down to DB2, trying to catch up on freeing up of space and reorganizing things, those can often have significant effects on things that require some significant diagnostic work to determine that was the root. So the key is you may need to call support to help with that, but knowing that again, right, knowing how you've kind of moved off your norm is critical. And the second thing I would add is as you are looking at increasing activity or workload, is that you often fall back to the blueprints that we talked about in our last SpectrumCast, and see if maybe you've moved beyond, that blueprint that you were at. If you started off at a small or a medium, and you've moved up to that next architectural level as we have it defined, because that may just give you some immediate insight into what you need to do from a resource perspective to help get the maintenance cycle back, where it needs to be for your current workload.
Todd, thanks for that. I always appreciate when folks reference older episodes, only because the fact that it means we're kind of continuing to build on it and add particular value. So Tim, I think this is a very informative session today. And remember, for everyone listening, right, our objective here is only to be able to help our clients better understand their end-to-end data resilience environment. And as challenges arise in these particular environments, no matter what they are, right, we want to be able to help provide the tools that you can use to be able to help yourself in the most expeditious manner first, before you might have to call support. So with that, everyone, I want to say thank you very, very much. I appreciate all your help today, and please stay tuned. We'll be posting these episodes on a weekly basis coming up here, and have a great day until next week. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Steve.
Thanks, guys.